Whether it's bad planning, bad luck, bad timing, or bad inventions, well-intentioned bad decisions have plagued history for thousands of years. Welcome to Historic Hindsight. Hello and welcome to another episode of Historic Hindsight. I'm John, that's Tom, and today we're going to talk to you about railroads.
Railroads in the Civil War, Johnny, and I want to preface a couple of things before we start. First, if there are any women that watch at home, according to period attire, I am a little underdressed, and I do apologize for that. I hope you forgive me. I do have my vest on, so I'm not naked, but it is hot as balls. I thought we were done with summer, but apparently in Indiana, it went from like 70-degree glorious weather to 90 again.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I didn't want to say anything off the get-go, but you're looking rather slovenly.
I do need a shave. I do need a haircut.
I mean, it looks like you've been out at battle for a while.
I've been in the field for a minute.
Yeah.
And I also want to say that my stress level's a little high. So if you notice that my face droops, I may be having a stroke. There may be a few more F-bombs than normal. And that is why I'm trying to drink the calming White Claw that might not make me so amped up as beer.
Yeah, I think maybe that'll help a little bit. But yeah, we'll be keeping an eye on the left side of your face and see if you start slurring any of your words that not alcohol related slurring.
Not alcohol related slurring. Yeah. All right. So you might be sitting at home like, who the fuck cares about railroads in the Civil War? Why are we even talking about that? Well, we're talking about that because the Civil War was one of the United States' first modern war. In fact, it's probably one of the global world's first modern war. And by modern war, I mean there were aircraft. We did have balloon, aerial observations. It's limited, but we did.
It's a funny thought to have to even just considering balloons aircraft, which I get it, they are. Yeah. But when you hear the word aircraft, that's not what comes to mind.
It's the first use of aerial observation. Before then, if you wanted a view of the battlefield that wasn't ground level, you go up into the mountains if there were mountains around you, and that was your best bet.
And they were exclusively used for observation, right? Like there were there weren't cannons attached and people flying over trying to fire cannons.
They didn't have quite the technology to get a hot air balloon with it. That would have been awesome, though. There was a specific type of cannon that was made, the Weird cannon, that had a elevation pitch that could go up a lot higher than the standard cannon.
There you go.
Specifically to shoot down potential balloons. So
I was gonna say
ground to air, attacks.
Yeah, I was gonna say you flip that one upside down, and then you have a lot of range from your hot air balloon.
I think the weight of the gun might have been a little bit counterintuitive. Because by hot air balloon, I miscredit that. It's not so much hot air balloon as it is they literally take coal gas and fill a balloon with coal gas, which is all kinds of awful, caustic disgustingness, and that's what gives them the elevation.
Well, right. But
it's not even your traditional hot air balloon where you got that little...
a modern hot air balloon is just a cleaner version of that. I mean, they're essentially doing the same thing. It's the hot air and gases rising. So
I guess
it's a noxious chemical or not is irrelevant.
Well, the balloons of their time are more akin to like a helium balloon than it really is a hot air balloon, if that makes sense. There is a gas that's filling this balloon as opposed to
but it's not a consistent you can keep adding and
nothing like that. Nothing like that.
We're not that. Fill it up, go up, and come back down.
But we do have that. We do have modern artillery that have impact explosive rounds, that have indirect fire capabilities, all that fun stuff that comes with modern artillery. We do have the invention and very limited use of rapid fire weaponry like a Henry repeating rifle or a Gatling gun, although again that was very, very limited.
Now, was it limited because of the time? Like, did it start to happen towards the end of the war, or was it limited just because of the limited technology?
The Henry was out through the whole war, but there was only ever 15,000 guns produced, so the amount that actually saw combat was minuscule.
Yeah.
And the Spencer repeating rifle, that was another one of the repeating rifles, it really didn't get into the field until about mid-1863. Okay. And again, it wasn't a standard weapon. And then, of course, by rapid fire, like the Gatling gun, which is close as we can get to a machine gun, it was invented in 1862, but really didn't get into it never got adopted by the U.S. military and didn't really get into the field until the siege of Petersburg. So very, very last tail end. And it was limitedly used. And it had no real impact. But we do have trench warfare. We do have accurate rifled guns that are capable of hitting targets well beyond what we used to have.
Seems
We
like an
do,
oversight for the government not to adopt a Gatling gun. Like,
yeah, we'll get it. Well, eventually, at one point, I'm going to do episodes and all that, and get into why they potentially didn't adopt some of these more modern firearms, and what the oversight was there. But yeah, it was to a degree an oversight. And we do have rapid transport. So prior to the Civil War, if you wanted to move a large army, your option was foot, pony, horse, mule, some
right,
animal transport, and then a wagon, which is pulled by said animal
equestrian.
transport.
Yeah.
So really, your transportation is limited to around 20 to 40 miles a day. But
Okay.
prior to the Civil War, we have railroads, which provide you mass transit in rapid succession. Now you can move an army 50, 100, 200 miles in a day, and that's a reasonable expectation because of trains.
Yeah,
And so
that's great.
that's why I'm talking about trains. So if you're conducting a type of warfare, whether that's offensive or defensive at this time with this technology, you're likely going to use trains or want to use trains to help you get your enemies to where they need to be, when they need to be, and as quickly as they can.
All right, so trains helped expedite transportation. That makes sense. Why? But like everybody has north and south. Like it's not like
North,
trains are only in one side, right? So
yes,
why?
north and south have railroads. So I'm going to go through how the South used the railroads and how they may have lost the war because they didn't use the railroads.
Okay.
So this first little chunk, bear with me here. It's going to be an explanation. This is kind of almost a thesis that I had written at one point in time that I'm taking clippets out of, but why they're important, how they're important, how we go from there. So General Ulysses S. Grant, none other than U.S. Grant, the best U.S. general during the Civil War and probably the best general ever because he has an awesome name, U.S.
I mean,
Mother effing Grant.
to be a US of A general with the initials US is
Come on,
pretty spectacular.
He said, the art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike at him as hard as you can, and keep moving.
So the steamroller
So, yeah,
idea.
the steamroller effect.
Yeah.
Hit hard, hit quick, move. Hit hard, hit quick, move.
Like a boxer.
Like a boxer.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, fly like a butterfly, sting like a bee.
Yeah, this philosophy translates to all sorts of different areas. Good philosophy.
And during the Civil War, the fastest way to do that was by rail.
Yeah.
And if you have a unified rail system, it is efficient, it is effective, and you can move troops and supplies to where you need quickly and efficiently without real problems.
Oh wait,
If you have a
hold up.
unified rail system.
Yeah, unified rail. What do you mean unified? It's a rail system. It's a train. You
Right.
lay down the train tracks and you get to travel along the train tracks.
So
And
if a nation, for instance, like the Confederacy, which was, this isn't disputable, you can't argue this, they had less men, they had less equipment, they had less manufacturing capabilities in the North. So the North won in all those major things you kind of really want in an army. Like you want more people, you want more equipment, and you want more means to build new equipment for the
Right.
lost equipment.
Well, and the reason for their having fewer factories to producing is they were farmers, and in the North is where you built the factories. You didn't
Yes.
have the same farmland and everything else.
And there's
So
less people living in the South than the North.
the North
which is
had the
why
farm. Right,
Lincoln
because
won.
yeah, because if you have a factory, you have to have basically a city of people, or a very small city, but a city of people to run that factory. If you have a farm, it's you and your wife and your family, and
And 23 slaves.
a couple of farm hands, or something similar to that. And so it's a much smaller bit. So yeah, that makes sense.
So if you're an army and you have less men, you have less equipment, and you have less means to repair or replace that equipment, it is very imperative that you're able to move what little you have to where the enemy is as quickly as you can. Okay.
Right,
And
it's like a
again-
David Goliath thing. It's the small guy, like the smaller person. If they're more mobile, if they're quicker, if they're able to get in and out better, it's guerrilla warfare style type stuff. You know, they're not going to be able to take on a whole army, so you got to be able to be faster.
Yes, and a
and
great
better.
example of this is at the first Battle of Bull Run, which if you haven't seen our episode, please go back and watch it. I'll put a link in the description maybe, and if the stupid thing at the end of YouTube works right, you'll have that too. But there will be a link in the description. But if you go back and watch that battle, the Confederates at Manassas or Bull Run, depending on whatever you want to use the name, they were outnumbered.
We'll use the winner's name.
the Bull Run then,
for it.
they were outnumbered by the Union soldiers at the initial start of the battle.
Yeah.
Now, they moved, I think it was around 15,000 men from Winchester, which is, I believe, 50 miles away, to Bull Run and Manassas to reinforce what troops were there. And then, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched the episode already, the Confederates win the very first major battle of the Civil War because they used the railroads to get their limited supplies to where it needed to be as quickly as it needed to be. Again, I'm beating a dead horse, but to reiterate this enough, I have a General Sherman from the North, who in his memoirs discusses how important and vital railroads, trains were to the Union assault.
Yeah.
He said during his, Georgia campaign, they had 4 groups of trains that were daily making 160 cars of 10 tons each. So what is that? 160,000 tons or something along those lines, or 100, something like that, or 10,000, 60 tons, something like that. Yeah, 10,000, 60 tons of equipment, four of these every day running. These equipments allowed the soldiers to, by the railroads, supply 73 miles long on the rails to supply an army of 100,000 men and 35,000 animals for a period of 190 days. So one train could supply 100,000 men, 35,000 animals for 190 days. One train. They have 4 of these running basically daily.
Well, I mean, what was the army size of
Sherman's?
Of Sherman's at the time?
Yeah, Sherman Army, that was more than enough to supply Sherman.
Living in excess, I would say.
They were living in excess. He said they delivered regularly that amount of food foraged by ordinary wagons that would have required 36,800 wagons and 6 mules each to equivalent what they had in the rails.
Yeah.
So again, basically what he's saying in his whole memoir here is that had it not been for the railroad, it would have been an astronomical feat to supply their army with the means that it needed to continue a forced march like it had through the entire campaign of Georgia.
An impossible feat. There's no, you can't do it.
Yeah, you would have had to have 36,800 wagons.
How are you going to find all those 36,800 wagons? You're not. And
you wouldn't have been able
to get them in the same spot, and then to coordinate, and then to load, and then to track. Like, it's insane. You can't.
Not to mention, in the region that they were marching through, the road conditions weren't sufficient to support 38,000 wagons.
Yeah. So you're going down a trail with 38,000 wagons, and wagon number 1,084 hits something and breaks a wheel, and now what?
Exactly. Now what? He says, therefore and this is a quote, therefore I reiterate that the Atlanta campaign was an impossibility without these railroads, and only then, because we had the men and the means to maintain and defend them, in addition to what were necessary to overcome the enemy. So the Union had the men and the equipment necessary to keep the railroads running, and in addition to that, the men necessary to overwhelm the enemy. Without the railroad, the Union would have lost the war.
The railroads are MVP.
Yes, the railroads are the MVP. They are Peyton Manning and Super Bowl against the Bears. Although I call bullshit on that Super Bowl, but that's another.
That was a bad Super Bowl, but I'll take the win.
That's another story. So now you might be wondering, well, how did the Confederates use their railroad?
I mean, I would assume the same way. It's a railroad.
It's a railroad, right? So I'm going to break this down into several different categories, and part of it will be cultural, part of it will be economic, and part of it will be like manufacturing capabilities, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So for the cultural thing, we have this institution that we don't like to talk about with the Confederacy. There's an institution of slavery, right?
What? Wait, during the Civil War?
Yeah, crazy. And you might be sitting there thinking at home, oh, what the hell does slavery got to go with choo-choo trains? Well, I'll tell you.
Or even the Civil War in general.
Or in the Civil War in general.
States' rights, right? Like,
yeah, right. So because they are a agrarian culture that focuses on the use of slavery to support that agrarian culture.
To exist.
Because we don't have tractors to farm. You have to have people to farm.
Yep.
And apparently white people weren't willing en masse to pick cotton.
Well, I mean, to be fair, you had to have something to pick the cotton, and now we have tractors. Back then, they had slaves from Africa, which weren't people, and so it's still not people doing the
To
work,
clarify,
right?
Johnny's saying what they thought, not what he feels. So please don't get mad at us. But
I
yes, they
thought that
didn't
was
view them.
obvious, but
Yes,
yes,
yes, they didn't view
absolutely.
them. I'm clarifying. So
I
we
mean,
don't.
for God's sakes, wasn't it after the Civil War that they were declared as 3/5 of people? Like
No, that was before the Civil War.
that was
That
before
was
the Civil War. Okay,
that was for vote. So like because the South was so outnumbered by the North in votes that they're like, well, 3/4 a black person counts as a person,
well,
so
three
these black
fifths,
people who
but
can't vote should still count as our the electoral college
yeah. Oh, okay.
votes.
So that was my American education system and just my own timeline, putting that after the Civil War. I do think it's funny though that the only reason they wanted to consider blacks as people was a population discrepancy for elections, and even then, they couldn't
They
be
weren't
like,
people.
well, they're real people. Let's count them all as one because I mean, for crying out loud, we're all Homo sapiens, right? They didn't go that way. They're like, we think that 3/5 of these folks should be considered people just so that we can get more representatives. That's fantastic.
Isn't it? Yeah. By the way, you know what else is fantastic? I don't care if you're making fun of me at home. White Claw is delicious, and specifically this natural lime White Claw.
I've not tried any White Claws or anything, but there's always a reason why a
Is
drink
something that's popular.
becomes viral, as they say, and
Yeah,
takes the country by storm.
this is delicious.
And it's
So
either Four Loko with crazy alcohol concentration
this
or it's something delicious.
this agrarian culture focused more on cash crops, and you might think of agrarian culture. At least they're producing corn and food products and all that kind of stuff. No, no, no.
Nah.
They're mainly focused on exports of cash crops. So you have tobacco, the big export. You have
Yep.
cotton, big export. But they're not turning the tobacco and they're not turning the cotton into usable goods because we don't have a
Right.
manufacturing base in the South. They're just actually exporting these, taking the money in, and then using that money to buy goods from, let's say, London.
They're raw material distributors, basically.
So your rail system then, instead of being built to support an industrial base, so large city to large city to large city to large city, where we're interconnected, you have a rail system I have a central dispatch zone where all the local farms go and drop their goods, and then that goes to a central city hub to get shipped out to London.
Okay, that makes sense so far.
So
You're
instead of having all your cities basically connected by rail, you have pockets of rail connections.
so okay, but so the central hubs though don't go to then from major city to major. This isn't a rural hub for people to drop off, take it to a big city, and then all the big cities are connected. It's just
You have at the time of the Civil
actual
War,
city.
yeah, at the time of 1861, you have basically in the South 5 major rail hubs. Those 5 hubs are
Okay,
connected, but outside of those 5 hubs, you're lost.
you're just spider webbing off of that.
You're very limitedly spidered off.
Okay,
And I mean, basically, what you have is you have these 5 central hubs, and you have wagon trains that bring you to these essentially
gotcha.
5 central hubs.
Yeah.
Yep.
Taking a bus to the train station, as it were.
Exactly. So at the start of the Civil War, and to show you the discrepancy here, the Union had 22,000 miles of rail in the North.
Okay.
Pretty much every city was connected, or every major city was connected. In the South, you had 9,500.
Woof.
The
Less
square
than
mile,
half.
and to think, in the Confederacy, you have Texas,
Yeah, they
large landmass.
that should have 9,000 on its own.
You have the
Like,
swamp South. Louisiana with Nolans. You
yeah,
have Mississippi with Jackson.
Georgia.
You got Atlanta, Georgia.
You got to get down
You
into
got
Jacksonville or anything, or does that exist
Florida.
yet?
Yeah, Jackson. I said Jackson, Mississippi. Jacksonville,
Okay, well,
Mississippi.
Jacksonville. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, you even have to dip down into the Panhandle, which
You
is
got the
which is like most the North can at least link linearly for the most
you got
part.
the
If you have to take a
Panhandle,
dip down into the penis of the United States, then
and
you're having
that's
an
just
issue.
the swamp South. You still have Virginia. You still have Tennessee, South Carolina,
Yeah.
North Carolina. But we got boats on them, so screw the whole rail
I
thing.
mean, those, yeah. As you've often said, our Navy was sitting pretty.
And by the way, that whole manufacturing thing that the Confederacy is not doing, you know what they're also not doing? They're also not producing steel for those rail lines. And in
Oh, where
fact,
did
at
they
the
get that
start of the
from?
Civil, yeah, what?
Where'd they get that from? The steel?
They're getting that from London.
London. Okay,
They're getting that from England.
that's
In
got to be
fact, the
cheap.
majority of the rail lines are owned not by the Great Confederacy, but they are owned by private institutions in London.
Huh?
Weird.
How is the South gonna let the North make rules for them and then also still be tied to the motherland
The
through debt,
motherland. These are
basically?
people who are like, America, rights, freedom, but London, you're going to make all my shit for me and you're going to own all my rail lines.
Yeah, well, you know.
Then we go on to the whole other cultural thing, states' rights. States' rights.
That's right. That's what the Civil War was all about.
Sure. Central belief in the Confederacy was the idea of limited federal government, Johnny. Limited federal government. Individual states had the rights to hold their own beliefs, to hold their own laws, to hold their own regulation. And that, Johnny, does not stretch too far from those rail lines.
So they wanted limited government regulation, but still some please government aid and money to help us continue to exist.
So these rail lines, when the Civil War started, the North, argue fascism, whatever you want to argue, Lincoln had Congress approve an order that all the rail lines in the North would be put under essentially military control and would all be regulated by military. So the first and foremost priority is the military transportation. We're at a time of,
in a time of war,
we're in a conflict.
Fine, I get it. That makes sense.
To the South, at no point in time during the war did they ever say that the South, the Confederacy has control of the railroads. Instead, they let the individual corporations that own these railroads maintain control.
That's right. States' rights. Wait, the corporations, not the states?
Well, yeah, states' rights.
Shoot.
Part of this problem means that there's no standard gauge rail, Johnny. You might be wondering, what the hell is gauge rail and standard? Like, don't trains just all run on the same tracks, right? Isn't that
That's what I've been saying. A train's a train.
A train's a train, right, Johnny? And in the North, you are right. Trains use the standard gauge of 4 foot, 8 inches and 1/2, which is the standard that was set in England. Who invented the trains?
Right.
England, sidebar, England, and I don't know how much of this is true or not, but I'm going to go ahead and believe it is and screw it, whatever. I'm going to facilitate falsities.
All right, yeah, let's post an audio meme out here for everybody.
But allegedly, this standard goes back to horses pulling wagons, so literally the width of a horse's ass is the gauge of the rail. So basically,
that's a really great meme. It's also just completely fabricated.
I'm sure it is. But to be fair, the width of most wagons were around 4 feet, 8.5 inches.
Right.
Most of the roads at the time, they were ruts. Yeah. But in any case, the North, all the railroads in the North standardized on 4 foot, 8 inches, because even before the Confederacy happened, and even before the Civil War happened, the North was like, yeah, we probably want these trains to be interconnected at some point.
I mean, if the point of a train is to go from one major city to another, why would you want to go from city A to city B and then from city B to city C all of a sudden is not the same? And so you have to get off and find a new train that's going to go from B to C. When originally you could have just stayed on the train, slept through the stop, and then gone on your way, right? Like,
exactly. But here's what the Confederacy did. First off, they had multiple gauge rails ranging anywhere from 4 feet all the way up to 5 feet gauge. The two most prominent were 4 feet 8 inches or 5 feet. But still, if I have a 5 feet gauge rail, it can't butt up against that 4 foot 8 gauge rail.
Yeah,
or that 4 foot 9 inch rail.
Yeah.
Or that 4 foot 2 inch rail.
Well, and even if you could create something that would make it butt up, guess what? That train that was built for the 5 foot rail is not going to ride on the 4 foot 8 trail.
No, it's not,
because
Johnny.
It's not a car. It's a freaking train on rails.
And do you know why that was done? Because every one of these trains was privately owned. Every one of these rail companies was privately owned. And all of them didn't want intercompetition. You ride my rail line and only my rail line. So I will drive you from Virginia, for instance, to Chattanooga. But if you want to go from Chattanooga to Jacksonville, you're going to have to not only change rail systems, you're going to have to unpack that train, get onto a whole new train with a whole new set of cars to go and do that. And they did this intentionally so they would not compete. So literally, in some instances, you have trains that have to stop and change halfway through a city because the city had two different rail lines running through it.
So, okay. So you mentioned earlier how many troops or how much supplies were able to be transferred during this. And it was enough to support 100,000 people, 35,000 animals, whatever those numbers were. Like, it's one thing to be like, okay, we're people and we're going to get off this train and get onto the other with our one bag of luggage or whatever. That's going to take 20, 30 minutes tops. If you have to unload and reload 100, supplies for 100,000 people.
To be specific, the numbers you're referencing is 1,600 tons per train.
Yeah. You know how long that's going to take to carry from one train to the next, only to maybe have to do it again? Jesus Christ!
That's
Like, you're
time
not
lost.
getting your support systems quickly.
Yeah, that's time lost. That's troops not getting to the location they need to as quickly as they can. That's troops not getting the food that they need as quickly as they can. That's troops not getting the ammunition that they need to as quickly as they can. That's troops not getting guns as quickly as they need to in case there was an incident where we lost this guy.
Right.
Because, shit happens during war.
Well, and also we've talked in our past Civil War episodes about how ill-equipped all of these, regiments and everything were anyway. And so you already have ill-equipped people going to war for you, and now you're going to not be able to get them fresh equipment, new equipment, additional equipment quickly.
To give you an idea of how bad this became, in 1862, already, we're in the beginning half of the war. 1862, we have the Second Battle of Manassas approaching us. Second Battle of Bull Run, which, spoiler alert, dirty rebels were in that one too. But they are
it's home court advantage. Is that what that is? Like, what's going on there?
But at this point, the city is being pressed. They are absolutely terrified that the city is going to be overrun. They have 1 million pounds of meat and a rail line that's controlled by the private entity that does not focus on military application over civilian application, that says to the military, sorry about you. We don't know what to tell you. Are you going to pay us? Are you going to buy a ticket to? Is each pound of meat going to buy a ticket to this? Johnson, who was the overall commander at the time, had no means to override them, had no means to force the railroad companies to pack the meat up and to transport it down to Richmond.
I mean, he had some means, just means he wasn't willing to take. I mean, a hostile takeover is going to do it, but, he wasn't willing to do that, and that's fair.
But the rail companies, who never were told that they had to prioritize military over civilian application, told him essentially to F off. And because they could not afford to lose that 1 million pounds of meat to the north, they burned that 1 million pounds of meat. Now, do you think a country that's limited resources could afford to lose 1 million pounds of food for their soldiers, let alone for the civilians?
Here's the thing. That's the type of thing, like burning food and, burning crops, that sort of thing. That's what happens when, like, Genghis Khan comes to your village. He burns your food to starve you out, the people who he doesn't just kill. Like, but that's not something that you do that when it's your meat and supplies. Like, what the? Self-censored. There you go.
There you go. Self-censored. By 1863, to tell you how slow the railroads were running in the South, the Confederate rail lines were averaging 10 miles of transport per hour. That's it. So even if the military was able to tell the civilians to F off and get on the trains, which on a lot of occasions, the civilian transport took priority over the military transport. So they're like, no, we got to run these guys to Richmond. You didn't buy a ticket. Sorry about you. We're going.
Yeah.
But only average 10 miles an hour.
That is crawling.
That is crawling for what is supposed to be rapid transport. Yeah. In comparison, the Union was averaging 40 miles an hour.
Yeah, 25% speed.
Of what the Union could produce.
especially when something say the distance that the North has to travel is, I don't know, 6 hours of train travel. That's an
In a
entire day for you if you're the Confederate.
in a short distance, when the cavalry that's riding ponies, a very ancient invention,
I'm not
could out
invention like
well
it's an animal.
the
I guess
animal has
I guess
it's animal
depending.
husbandry. They like learn how to like, hey, this pony, if we treat it right, will let us ride it. Like, I mean, there was it is a progress in human civilization, Johnny. That's all I'm saying. It's a very
That's
old
fine. Yeah,
progress in
and I
human
guess
civilization.
depending on your religious beliefs, it may be an invention. So there you go.
There
I'll
you go.
accept it. I'll go ahead and allow it.
You'll allow it. You're allowed. Okay, great. That cavalry in a very short distance could travel faster than a train could, going 10 miles an hour on average.
I was gonna say
In a
something,
short
but I
distance.
didn't.
In a short distance.
But I didn't want to be embarrassed by saying, like, it seems like horses could probably get you further faster than 10 miles an hour. Obviously, they're not going to have the endurance, but
Yeah, they definitely could over short distance. I mean, they're
yeah,
not going to be, a train can run all night long, all day long, assuming it has water and fuel,
right.
fuel being coal or wood,
Yeah.
which that's another story, because what did the Confederacy not have a lot of? Coal. So they were forced to chop down trees but anyway, that's really minor in comparison to, but whatever.
Right, but that's a consideration that I wouldn't have even taken into account is access to, I mean, because they're all steam engines at the time, right?
Yes, steam engine, yes.
And so yeah, access to be able to fill your boiler and power your engine. And coal burns hotter and is a lot smaller than a bunch of bundles of wood.
It sure is. It will get you whatever they call the fuel cart, the cart that's right behind the engine that holds the fuel for the car. You can get a lot farther on a cart full of coal than you can on a cart full of wood.
Yeah, no
doubt. By the way, though, Johnny, besides the whole fact that the cavalry can do it in a short distance, these private companies that continue to fight over each other for profits were also actively sabotaging each other and not cooperating with each other. So again, besides the gauge,
shocking.
You'd have Railroad A, even if the gauge lined up. So even if you both had 4'8" gauge, if you went from, I'm making this up, if you went from Tennessee Railroad line to Virginia Railroad line, Virginia would be like, we're not going to have your trains and your trailers or carts or whatever they call them on our track. So they still had to unload everything and put it on the other company's train.
So this is like a Budweiser truck being like, I need to deliver this beer, and then being like, well, yeah, you can use our road, but you have to move all your beer into our Coors Light truck or whatever.
Because we don't want to see people see us driving a,
It's literally just them complaining about marketing and advertising.
Very much so. Now, this the very beginning of the war, and you can argue that this could very well be the reason why the Confederacy lost as well. But because of this and the use of the railroads really ties it all together. President Jefferson Davis, at the very start, orders the Confederate Army to conduct a purely defensive campaign. There was only two incidences where the Confederacy in any kind of mass took the fight to the north on northern territory.
So basically the idea there is we're going to treat this like in 1776 the United States treated their Revolutionary War, where it's just like, hey, we're a country now, come tell us we're not.
Yes. And that worked very well for us because there was an ocean in between us and
right.
London.
Yeah. Obviously, it's a lot easier to do when there's the Atlantic Ocean between you and your enemy.
So there's only so many troops that England can get over to the United States at any given time. And if that army, for instance, like at Yorktown, were to get surrounded and surrender, you can't just go to your neighbor and replace them.
Right.
The problem is here in the United States, and I can argue the semantics about the defensive war and whether that was a good call or bad call. Well, the North is right there.
Yeah, it's across the street.
They have the trains that can come quickly. There's no ocean barrier. So if you defeat the army of 50,000, well, guess what? There's another army of 50,000 right behind it. Coming right now.
Right. I was gonna say it's you have the army fighting, and reinforcements are hours away, not days away. Like
Months away
or
in the case of
yeah.
the Revolutionary War. Yeah. Uh, and so, but still, you could still operate a defensive campaign, but this is where the railroads become imperative then. If you have 5 central hubs, which those 5 central hubs are Richmond, Petersburg, Chattanooga, Atlanta, and Jackson, Mississippi, those 5 central hubs become imperative to control, contain, maintain. You don't want to lose any one of them.
Right.
Because if used appropriately in a defensive campaign, if I have limited troops, which is fine, if I have
Yeah.
limited troops, and all of a sudden the North is attacking Chattanooga, I can move my troops from Richmond, Virginia to Chattanooga in a quick succession. And that's exactly what happened at the Battle of Chickamauga. Longstreet was able to move his army 950 miles and secure a victory against the Union at the Battle of Chickamauga. Of
Yeah.
course, it also helps that the entire army that surrendered at Vicksburg, that said they would go home and not fight the North again, regrouped and fought the North again. But still, besides that, they really won because of these reinforcements that were 950 miles away in Virginia
Yeah.
that traveled by rail to Chickamauga.
Yeah, basically, like you said earlier, if you're an overpowered army, you need to have speed. And if you have, even if you only have 5 stations set up, if all you're doing is playing defense, you can bounce troops around and make up for the disparity between how big their army is and how big your army is.
You sure can. But the problem is that battle resulted in the siege of Chattanooga, which is where the central hub is.
Ah, shoot.
The Union takes over Chattanooga and bunkers in Chattanooga while the Confederates siege them.
Yeah.
The Confederates are able to break out of that siege. And by the end of 1862, beginning of 1863, the Union Army now controls the hub.
The Union broke out of
Chattanooga.
that siege, right?
Yes, the Union
Okay,
broke out
the
of the siege.
Union broke out of the
And
siege, and
now they control Chattanooga.
and that is one of 5 hubs.
One of 5 hubs. 6
And
months earlier,
yikes.
the Union Army took Jackson, Mississippi, where the Confederates, when fleeing, would leave 90 locomotives, 90 trains,
What?
and several hundred rail cars.
Okay, 90 actual, not
Trains. 90
90
locomotives.
pieces of
No,
train
90
not one train,
trains.
95. 90 locomotives.
And
And then
several
the train-
hundred cars.
How do you even the amount of space that would take up? How do you even leave that many somewhere? Like,
Well, because it is a major rail hub. It's one of the 5 major rail hubs. And they did not have time to retreat them because wait, those rail hubs don't line up with the Chattanooga rail hubs.
oh my! So they just
They left them.
they ended themselves basically.
By July 1864, Petersburg is now under siege, along with the whole Petersburg siege isn't really like a surround of Petersburg, but Petersburg, Atlanta, they're all under siege, basically limiting how much rail transport can go from Atlanta to Petersburg.
Well, that's the other thing. You don't have to completely siege a city if you control a rail system, or if you only have to control the rail system. You have to control that line of transportation, not the entire perimeter around it.
So by July, basically at this point, you have 4 of the major rail hubs that are either completely controlled by the North or limitedly used by the Confederacy. By the way, Atlanta has actually all 5, because Atlanta has already fallen by 1864. So all 5 of the hubs are either in control of the North or limited being able to be used by the South. Essentially, by 1864, you're left. By the end of 1864, you have Richmond and Petersburg, and that's it. And it's very limited on how much can be used.
You're fighting a different war at that point, because
They are
now
fighting-
you've been reverted to, if you want to transport supplies, guess how you're doing it? With horses and a wagon. And so you're fighting a war that should have taken place 20 years ago against somebody who has modern technology.
And I maintain that war, if it was fought 20 years ago, could have very easily ended in a different way.
Yeah.
If the war started before rail lines, it very, very easily could have been a Confederate victory.
Right, because especially with the length of the war, because if you're the North and you're just continuously fighting and you're losing battles, it's like at some point people are going to turn and be like, guys, just let them go, like let it F it. Like, we're losing too many people and too many things. But when you have, victory after victory and you're starting to gain momentum, people will stick with it.
Exactly. To make matters worse, in order for that defensive campaign to be successful, you had to make sure that those 5 rail line hubs stay intact. Beyond just falling into enemy hands, you have to make sure that those rail lines are maintained.
Yeah.
And as we had discussed earlier, the Confederacy did not have any substantial steel manufacturing to maintain said rails.
So a rail breaks, gets bent, whatever
They're
happens to
screwed.
it. Now that track is just useless.
And in fact, one of the ironic parts is most of the rail line in the South was newer than the rail line in the North at the start of the war.
Yeah.
But that very quickly changed as the war progressed.
Because the North was able to replace old rail.
Yeah, and the Confederacy wasn't.
Yeah.
It is estimated that it required 50,000 tons of iron and steel to replace and repair the railroad upkeep, just general wear and tear upkeep, not including what the Union would destroy, which we'll get to there in a second. The Confederacy was only able to produce 16,000 tons in its factories.
Holy moly.
Prior to the war, the vast majority of that iron and steel came from England. Well, now there's a blockade, so very limited of that is coming through. To make matters worse, Sherman, during his whole Atlanta campaign, had a tendency to call Sherman bow ties, Sherman neckties, where he would take said rail lines and destroy them. And when I say destroy them, I mean he would rip them up, superheat them, wrap them around a telegraph line or a tree, and tie them so that they could not be used again.
That's pretty baller. Like that.
Sherman neckties.
Now, that's, of course, different than, I think it's called a Cuban necktie, where they slit your throat and pull your tongue out through it, right?
Yeah, a little bit different there, Johnny. But effectively the same result, because within a month of Petersburg falling, which was in the spring of 1865, the Confederacy surrenders. When they lose essentially their last major hub of rail, they're done. They can't fight. How do you move troops? How do you move equipment? And I didn't stress this enough before, but I have to stress it enough now. At the entire time of this war, especially from 1863 on, especially if you look at the level of care of the Union soldiers in prison camps that the Confederacies had, everybody was starving. The prisoners were starving. The soldiers were starving. Soldiers would desert to go and find food and forage food. They're literally like attacking their own countryside to try to feed themselves because the Confederacy isn't able to supply food, let alone supply munitions, let alone supply guns, let alone supply anything else that was needed. So even if they had the people, which by the way they didn't, they had no means to keep them around and support them as an army.
I like the idea of prisoners in a POW camp starving and it not being anything malicious. It's just like, they're like, guys, we're literally starving. Some people are dying over here. And the guards and soldiers of the camp just being like, yeah, us too.
Yeah.
Like, we don't, like,
it
we're
was
the same
us.
boat
It
as
really,
you.
it legitimately really was us too. Now, to be fair, there were Union camps that soldiers did starve in, including here in Indiana.
Yeah.
Indianapolis specifically, at the old state fairgrounds. But
now we put carousels
and now we put
everything
carousels
on
and fried Twinkies there. That's another story for another time. So I can't reiterate enough the importance of the rail lines. I can't reiterate enough that had the Confederacy seceded before, it might have been more successful. Had they taken the fight to the north, it might have been more successful, which they did try on 2 occasions and lost on both occasions pretty spectacularly. I mean,
so maybe that was a little bit of a hindrance into why they didn't do it more. Like, guys, we tried a couple times and it was bad.
They did try to go into the north, and they kind of it is a Union victory, although it's more of a draw, but it's still a Confederate defeat because when they go at Antietam, they can't continue their campaign in the north, so they do have to retreat. But Gettysburg was a very spectacular whoopsies.
Yeah, so at Antietam, it was basically like they went and beat the shit out of a couple of people, and then they're like, oh, we're done, or like what?
Well, what essentially is at Antietam, and we'll do an episode on that in the future. It was essentially a draw battle. Like the battle itself, the Confederacy sort of held the ground, but couldn't maintain it. And part of the reason why they couldn't maintain it is because they didn't have the supply lines that they needed because they weren't using those choo-choo trains.
So all you're saying is basically if they had all the same rails gauges and had a communist type rail system where everything's the same and it's not owned by a bunch of individuals, then they would have won the Civil War and we'd be two countries right now.
They would have had a potential to, I will never go on the record and say the Confederacy could have actually won this war, because I strongly and firmly believe that they really had no chance given the massive oversight. I mean, the massive overwhelming numbers that the North could produce of equipment, of men,
Well,
of supplies like that. I really don't think they could have ever overcome it, but their best shot of being able to overcome it was to take the war to the North and make the North surrender, not because they seized large amounts of territory, but because they made the North not want to fight because we lost too many people.
right, yeah. Well, you start going into neighborhoods, you start going into cities, and people are like, F this. Like, I don't want people coming in and wrecking my city.
And the only way they could have been able to do that is if they had a system that would have been able to support that assault in the North, which would have been those rail lines,
Right.
that they didn't have.
Yeah, but
Or
I
didn't
mean,
use effectively,
right,
or,
and then
different gauges, or all the other million things that we talk about today that limited their ability to use them.
right, but essentially, it's the railways would have given them better opportunities. They would have won more battles. Maybe would have drawn the war out a little bit. But at the end of the day, they don't have the production capabilities to maintain and repair the rail lines, to maintain and repair weapons and ammunition and everything else. And so, at the end of the day, it's a lost cause anyway.
Oh my
likely.
God, lost cause revision. Sorry. It is a lost cause.
But
And by lost cause, I don't mean like lost reason why we fight, but lost cause is in like you were never gonna win that.
right, yeah, it's like, yeah, you go ahead and give yourself all the chances you are, but it's at the end of the day, you just don't have the infrastructure essentially to support a war, and so you're gonna have a hard time winning it.
If you don't have Thomas the Tank Engine on your side, you're never gonna win this war.
Man, Thomas the Tank, he's seen some shit. We might need to do an episode on that. Do you know that started like from some dystopian, like psychotic thing? Like, it was insane.
We'll
That
do an
show was
episode on
messed up.
We'll do an episode on Thomas the Tank Engine. Toot, toot. Sidebar, and then we're done with this episode. And I don't know if it'll actually make it in the episode or not. And if you have made it this far, congratulations. I love and appreciate every one of you.
Well done.
Well done, and I love and appreciate every one of you. But my son loved Thomas Tank Engine when he was younger. His favorite character on Thomas Tank Engine was Percy.
Yes.
But he couldn't say Percy. He kept saying Pussy.
Yes.
I love Pussy.
Same. My oldest. Same. Why would you name a train Percy for toddlers and children? And then why would you make it something that is going to be everybody's favorite?
Because they knew what they were doing,
Like
Johnny.
Percy,
that shit was intentional.
Percy was so
Pussy.
likable. And even in the show, because they're British, it doesn't sound like Percy.
Pussy.
It's Percy. That's okay. Yeah. Anyway.
And that, guys, is This Week in Historic Hindsight.
All right, that's it for this week in Historic Hindsight. Thanks for listening. Be sure to tune in next week when we talk about Indiana canals.